Chicago in the 1920s wasn't just Al Capone's playground. There was another force that controlled the wealthiest neighborhoods and the most profitable bootlegging operations in the Windy City. They were Irish, they were ruthless, and they refused to bow to anyone. Dean O'Banion, a former choir boy with a limp and a voice like an angel, led them. He ran his criminal empire from a flower shop across from a cathedral, attended mass regularly, and could arrange both a funeral wreath and a murder with equal skill. The story of Dean O'Banion and the Irish gangsters who controlled Chicago's North Side cannot be told without understanding the world that created them. In the early years of the 20th century, Chicago was a city transforming at breathtaking speed, swelling with immigrants seeking the American dream but finding instead overcrowded tenements, brutal working conditions, and a political system so corrupt that crime and government had become virtually indistinguishable. Charles Dean O'Banion was born on July 8, 1892, in Maroa, Illinois, a small town far from the violence and vice that would later define his life. His early years were unremarkable, the son of working-class parents in rural America. But around 1900, when his mother died, everything changed. His father, seeking better opportunities and perhaps escape from grief, moved the family to Chicago's North Side, to a neighborhood that Irish immigrants had claimed as their own and christened with a name from the old country, Kilgubbin, after an Irish place name. The neighborhood, now known as Goose Island, was notorious for its high crime rate, a place where poverty and opportunity collided in ways that shaped young men into either victims or victimizers. For young Dean O'Banion, fitting into this environment came naturally. The streets of Kilgubbin were not gentle places. They demanded toughness, loyalty, and a willingness to fight for every scrap of dignity and survival. In his teenage years, O'Banion formed bonds that would last his entire life, friendships forged in the crucible of street violence and mutual necessity. He gathered around him a small group of young men who would become legends in Chicago's criminal underworld. Earl Jaime Weiss, Vincent the Schemer Drucci, and George Bugs Morin. These were not casual friendships of convenience. They were blood bonds, the kind that form when young men face a hostile world together and decide that together they will not just survive but conquer. These boys joined what was known as the Market Street Gang, an organization that specialized in theft and robbery, feeding Chicago's growing black market with stolen goods. But their entry into organized crime took an unexpected turn through one of the most peculiar aspects of early 20th century Chicago life, the newspaper wars. Chicago during this period was home to multiple competing newspapers, each fighting viciously for circulation and advertising revenue. Mayor Big Bill Thompson ran what he proudly called a wide-open city, a place where rackets such as prostitution and gambling flourished with minimal interference, where bombings and murders were met with token official resistance, but often settled through uneasy truces among rivals. In this environment, newspapers became willing participants in violence, hiring street thugs to intimidate anyone who sold or read competing publications. The Market Street Gang initially worked for the Chicago Tribune, but they later switched allegiances to the rival Chicago Examiner when newspaper boss Moses Annenberg offered them better terms. O'Banion and his friends became sluggers, thugs whose job was to beat newsstand owners who sold the wrong paper, to threaten readers, and to ensure their employer's publication dominated their territory. Though these newspaper wars were later portrayed with dark humor in stage productions and films like The Front Page, the reality was far from comedic. The violence was real and sometimes lethal, with gunfights erupting in saloons and on city streets. Through Moses Annenberg, the gang met Charles the Ox Reiser, a skilled safecracker who taught them his trade. This education in professional crime proved invaluable. In 1909, O'Banion was arrested twice, first for safecracking and then for assault. He was convicted for robbery and assault, spending time in a correctional institution. These would be the only times O'Banion ever served in a correctional facility, despite a criminal career that would eventually encompass murder, bootlegging, robbery, and corruption on a massive scale. The newspaper wars also connected the gang to the political bosses of Chicago's 42nd and 43rd wards, powerful men who understood that elections could be won through violence and intimidation. The young Irish gangsters found steady work using violence to influence election outcomes, learning lessons about the intersection of crime and politics that would serve them throughout their careers. In Chicago, there was no meaningful distinction between legitimate political power and criminal enterprise. They were two sides of the same coin, and anyone who wanted to succeed needed to master both. By his late teens and early 20s, O'Banion had developed a particular set of skills that made him valuable in Chicago's criminal economy. He worked as a waiter at McGovern's Liberty Inn, where he cultivated an unusual talent that would become part of his legend. Each evening he would delight patrons with his beautiful Irish tenor voice. His singing voice was genuinely remarkable, the voice of a choir boy turned criminal. While customers enjoyed his performances, O'Banion's associates were picking pockets in the coachroom. He also mastered the art of drugging patrons' drinks, slipping them a Mickey Finn, as it was known, and when the intoxicated customers left the club, O'Banion and his friends would rob them. This combination of charm and criminality, of culture and violence, would define O'Banion throughout his life. He was not a simple thug. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed talents that in another life might have led to legitimate success. He could sing, he had a genuine appreciation for beauty, and he could move through both high society and the underworld with equal ease. This made him dangerous in ways that simple muscle could never achieve. As O'Banion and his gang matured, they attracted more followers and expanded their operations. Samuel Nails Morton, Louis Two Gun Altery, and handsome Dan McCarthy joined their ranks, each bringing their own skills and connections to what was becoming a sophisticated criminal organization. The North Side Gang, as it came to be known, began to dominate not just their own Irish neighborhoods, but also the Gold Coast, Chicago's wealthiest area situated on the northern lakefront of Lake Michigan. They ruled through a combination of violence, political connections, and genuine community support. In neighborhoods where the police were corrupt or absent, where city services barely existed, gangs like O'Banion's provided protection, employment, and a twisted form of social services for immigrant communities struggling to survive. In 1921, O'Banion made two significant decisions that revealed both his business acumen and his peculiar sense of propriety. First, he married Viola Caniff, bringing at least some conventional respectability to his life. Second, he bought an interest in William Schofield's flower shop in the River North area, near the corner of West Chicago Avenue and North State Street. This was not merely a front for his criminal operations, though it served that purpose well. O'Banion genuinely loved flowers and was an excellent arranger. He found in the shop a kind of refuge, a place where beauty could exist separate from the violence that defined his professional life. The location of Schofield's was perfect in ways both practical and symbolic. The shop sat directly across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, where O'Banion and Jaime Weiss attended Mass. Here was a man who could arrange a murder in the morning and attend religious services in the afternoon, who could kill without hesitation but never missed Sunday Mass. This contradiction was not hypocrisy in O'Banion's mind. It was the reality of being an Irish American in Chicago, caught between the old world's Catholicism and the new world's brutal capitalism. Schofield's became the florist of choice for mob funerals, a grimly appropriate business niche. O'Banion had a talent for creating beautiful funeral arrangements, and in Chicago's gang-ruled neighborhoods, there was never a shortage of customers. The rooms above Schofield's served as headquarters for the North Side Gang, where O'Banion planned operations, met with associates, and ran his growing empire. Then came January 16, 1920, and everything changed. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, and the Volstead Act made the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal throughout the nation. Prohibition, intended to create a more moral and orderly society, instead created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. For men like Dean O'Banion, prohibition was not a moral crusade, it was a gold mine. Chicago, with its large population of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, was a city that loved its beer, wine, and liquor. These were communities where alcohol was not just recreation but culture, woven into social gatherings, religious celebrations, and daily life. The notion that a law could eliminate this demand was laughable. What prohibition did was transform ordinary businessmen into criminals and criminals into millionaires. The money to be made in bootlegging was astronomical, and the market was guaranteed by millions of citizens who had no intention of giving up drinking simply because the government said they should. The members of the North Side Gang quickly took control of the existing breweries and distilleries in their territory. This gave them a near monopoly on the local supply of real beer and high-quality whiskey, a crucial advantage over rivals who could only provide rot-gut liquor and moonshine. Based on the North Clark Street restaurant McGovern's Saloon and Cafe, the North Side gang soon controlled the working-class neighborhoods of the 42nd and 43rd wards. They controlled a section of downtown that ran from Madison Street to the Chicago River, eastward to Lake Michigan. Beyond bootlegging, the gang continued to burglarize local stores and warehouses and run illegal gambling operations. However, unlike their rivals in the South Side, the North Side gang refused to traffic in prostitution. This was not merely a business decision, but a matter of identity and morality, however twisted that morality might seem. O'Banion and his mostly Irish gang drew a line. They would sell illegal alcohol, they would steal, they would kill, but they would not profit from the exploitation of women. In the hierarchy of criminal sins, this distinction mattered to them. O'Banion strengthened his political protection by assisting his politician friends in committing election fraud. He also ran a publicity campaign in the North Side, making large-scale donations to orphanages and charities, and providing food and loans to the poor and unemployed. This was the Robin Hood aspect of organized crime, the way gangsters maintained community support even as they engaged in brutal violence. In neighborhoods where legitimate institutions failed to provide basic services, where poverty crushed hope, the local gangster who ensured children didn't starve and widows didn't freeze became a hero, regardless of how he made his money. The North Side gang enjoyed considerable protection from the Chicago Police Department. O'Banion once threw a lavish banquet for Chicago politicians and police officials, an event that included Chief Detective Michael Hughes, Police Lieutenant Charles Evans, County Clerk Robert Schweitzer, Public Works Commissioner Colonel Albert A. Sprague, and a host of both Democratic and Republican politicians. The press dubbed it the Belshazzar Feast, and it was later investigated by Reform Mayor William E. Dever. The banquet was a brazen display of the corrupt relationship between crime and politics in Chicago. O'Banion was not hiding his connections, he was celebrating them, showing everyone that the men who were supposed to enforce the law were dining at his table, drinking his illegal liquor, and taking his money. In one particularly audacious crime in 1924, Chicago police actually assisted the North Side gang in robbing the Sibley Distillery, which had been under federal guard since the beginning of Prohibition. Escorted by Police Lieutenant Michael Grady and 4 detective sergeants, North Siders looted the distillery in broad daylight, taking 1,750 barrels of bonded whiskey worth approximately $100,000. Although Grady and the other police officers were later indicted for this crime, they were quickly dismissed. The message was clear. In Chicago, the law existed primarily to enrich those who claimed to enforce it. But O'Banion's dominance on the North Side brought him into conflict with powerful forces expanding from the South Side of Chicago. Johnny Torrio, known as Papa Johnny, headed the predominantly Italian South Side mob, which would later become known as the Chicago Outfit. Torrio's lieutenant was a brutal young man from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone, who would eventually become the most famous gangster in American history. In 1920, recognizing that constant warfare was bad for business, Torrio convened a meeting with all of Chicago's major bootleggers to work out a territorial system. The goal was to avoid bloody turf battles by dividing the city into recognized zones of control, allowing gangsters to pool their political power and their soldiers. O'Banion accepted the agreement and was given control of the North Side, including the desirable Gold Coast. As part of the deal, O'Banion even agreed to supply Torrio and Capone with some of his thugs to help them win the mayoral election of Cicero. The North Siders became part of a huge Chicago-area bootlegging combine. For a time, this arrangement held. O'Banion kept the North Side and the Gold Coast, but even got a slice of Cicero, a suburb controlled by Torrio and Capone on the south side of Chicago. They all shared profits from a lakefront casino called the Ship. The piece was profitable for everyone involved. Bootlegging money flowed in torrents, politicians stayed bought, and violence was directed at those outside the combine rather than at each other. But peace in the Chicago underworld was always fragile, built on temporary alignments of interest rather than trust or genuine friendship. Old hatred simmered beneath the surface, the hostility between Irish and Italian gangs, the resentments of men who had fought their way up from poverty and would not defer to anyone. O'Banion, for all his charm and business sense, was fundamentally proud and stubborn. He refused to sell portions of North Side distilleries to the South Siders, guarding his territory jealously. During several meetings arranged by Torrio, O'Banion would often insult the Italians, dismissing them with ethnic slurs and making clear his contempt. O'Banion also engaged in what was perhaps the most serious betrayal in the criminal code. he secretly hijacked South Side beer shipments and sold them back to their owners. This was not just theft, it was a calculated insult, a message that O'Banion did not fear retaliation and did not respect the agreements that supposedly governed Chicago's underworld. A third gang complicated the situation further. The Jenna brothers led the West Side Gang, and they were allied with Torrio's South Side organization. When the Jennas tried to expand their bootlegging and rackets operations into North Side territory, O'Banion was enraged. He saw this as a violation of the territorial agreements and as proof that Torrio could not or would not control his allies. The situation reached a crisis point over money and pride. Angelo Jenna had incurred a gambling debt at the Ship, the casino that O'Banion owned a piece of along with the Chicago outfit. On November 3, 1924, O'Banion made a telephone call to Jenna that became heated. As O'Banion had sat in with Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Frank Rio, and others to tally the week's profits, it was mentioned that Angelo Jenna had bet a large amount of cash plus a sizable marker. O'Banion demanded payment, and Jenna's response, or lack thereof, pushed the Irish gangster past his breaking point. But there was another, deeper betrayal brewing, one that would prove fatal. O'Banion offered to sell Torrio his share of the valuable Sebin brewery. On May 19, 1924, while Torrio was inspecting the property, O'Banion arranged for the police to raid the place and arrest Torrio. It was a setup designed to get Torrio in legal trouble while O'Banion pocketed money from the sale. This was not just business treachery, it was personal, a humiliation that Torrio could not ignore. After his release from custody, Torrio acceded to demands from the Jenna crime family, allies of Chicago outfit, to kill O'Banion. The decision was made, the peace was over. Dean O'Banion, the choirboy turned gangster, the florist who attended mass and arranged murders with equal facility, had pushed too far. He had insulted the wrong people, betrayed the wrong allies, and now he would pay the price that Chicago's underworld demanded for such transgressions. November 10, 1924, began as an ordinary day at Schofield's flower shop. O'Banion was working with his flowers, doing what he genuinely loved, surrounded by beauty in a life otherwise defined by violence. Then around noon, 3 men entered the shop. One was Frankie Yale, a Torrio associate from New York. With him were 2 known gunmen from the Jenna organization. Yale approached O'Banion with his hand outstretched in friendship. O'Banion, ever the gentleman even in death, extended his hand to shake Yale's. In that moment, Yale gripped O'Banion's hand tightly, holding him in place. The 2 Jenna gunmen opened fire. 6 bullets tore into O'Banion's body, 2 in the chest, 2 in the throat, and 2 in the face. He died among his flowers, his blood mixing with the water that fed the carnations and roses, the beauty he had created witnessing his violent end. The murder was never officially solved. Everyone in Chicago's underworld knew who had ordered it and who had carried it out, but knowing and proving were different things. The police investigation was perfunctory at best. In a city where gangsters dined with police chiefs and politicians took orders from criminals, justice was not even an aspiration, it was a joke. O'Banion's funeral was the biggest anyone could remember. Thousands attended, including, with breathtaking audacity, Al Capone and members of the South Side Gang. They came to pay respects to a fallen enemy, to be seen honoring the conventions that governed their world, even as everyone knew they had orchestrated his death. The flower arrangements were spectacular, a final irony. O'Banion, the master florist, received the grandest floral tribute Chicago had ever seen. But the funeral was not an ending, it was a beginning. O'Banion's death sparked what would become known as the Beer Wars, a brutal 5-year conflict between the North Side Gang and the Chicago outfit. The killing would continue, escalating in violence and brutality, until it culminated in an event that would shock even Chicago's violence-numbed citizens, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. The story of Dean O'Banion is not just the story of one man's rise and fall in Chicago's criminal underworld. It is the story of an immigrant community trying to carve out space and dignity in a hostile new world, using the only tools available to them: violence, organization, and a willingness to break laws that they saw as unjust or irrelevant. It is the story of how Prohibition transformed America, creating a criminal economy so vast and profitable that it corrupted every institution it touched. And it is the story of pride, the pride of a man who would not bow, would not compromise, would not accept second place, even when survival demanded it. The funeral of Dean O'Banion on November 14, 1924, was unlike anything Chicago had ever witnessed. more than 10,000 people lined the streets to watch the procession. The casket, silver and bronze and costing $10,000, required 12 pallbearers to carry it. Inside, O'Banion lay dressed in his finest suit, a rosary entwined in his fingers, looking for all the world like a respectable businessman rather than a man who had killed or ordered the killing of dozens of people. 26 truckloads of flowers followed the hearse, a grotesque irony that the flower-loving gangster would have appreciated. The arrangements came from all corners of Chicago's underworld, each more elaborate than the last, tributes from men who feared O'Banion, men who hated him, and men who had loved him like a brother. Among the mourners were Hymie Weiss, Vincent Drucci, and Bugs Morin, O'Banion's closest friends and most trusted lieutenants. Their grief was genuine and terrible to witness. These were hard men who had survived the brutal streets of Kilgubbin, who had fought in newspaper wars and prohibition battles, who had seen death in all its forms, yet they wept openly at the loss of their leader. But mixed with their grief was something darker and more dangerous, a cold, calculating rage that would soon ignite Chicago in ways that would make O'Banion's era of violence seem almost restrained by comparison. Also in attendance with an audacity that bordered on madness were Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and members of the Jenna Brothers organization. They came dressed in black, their faces masks of respectful mourning, sending enormous floral arrangements that dwarfed those of ordinary mourners. They shook hands with Weiss and the other Northsiders, offered condolences with voices dripping with false sympathy, and acted for all the world as if they had not orchestrated the murder of the man being buried. This was the theater of Chicago's underworld, where even murder followed certain protocols, where enemies could stand together at a funeral home and pretend at civilized behavior before returning to the streets to kill each other. The Catholic Church, always caught in an impossible position when it came to men like O'Banion, initially refused him a funeral mass. He was, after all, a known criminal, a bootlegger, a killer. But O'Banion's wife Viola, devastated by her husband's death, pleaded with the church, and eventually a compromise was reached. O'Banion would be buried in consecrated ground at Mount Carmel Cemetery, but without the full rites of a Catholic funeral. Even in death, O'Banion existed in that liminal space between respectability and criminality, between the faith he genuinely held and the violence he had genuinely committed. Within hours of O'Banion's burial, the North Side gang began planning their revenge. Leadership fell naturally to Earl Hymie Weiss, O'Banion's closest friend and most capable lieutenant. If O'Banion had been the charming face of the North Side gang, Weiss was its cold, calculating brain. Born Henryk Wojciechowski to Polish immigrants, Weiss had changed his name to something more Irish-sounding to fit in with the predominantly Irish gang. He was a devout Catholic like O'Banion, attending Mass regularly and never working on Sundays or religious holidays, but his piety did not extend to mercy for his enemies. Weiss was different from O'Banion in crucial ways. Where O'Banion could laugh and joke even in tense situations, Weiss was serious and methodical. Where O'Banion sometimes acted on impulse, driven by pride or anger, Weiss planned carefully, considering every angle before moving. He suffered from severe migraine headaches that would lay him low for days at a time, and during these episodes, he would retreat to the couch on the second floor of Schofield's flower shop, the same rooms where O'Banion had conducted business, lying in darkness while his mind worked through the problems facing the gang. Under Weiss's leadership, the North Side gang transformed from a bootlegging operation that sometimes used violence into a war machine dedicated to a single purpose: the destruction of Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and everyone associated with them. The peace that had governed Chicago's underworld, fragile as it was, shattered completely. The beer wars had begun, and they would turn Chicago's streets into a battlefield for the next 5 years. The first major strike came on January 12, 1925, just 2 months after O'Banion's death. Johnny Torrio and his wife Anna were returning to their apartment building on South Clyde Avenue. It was early afternoon, a time when the streets should have been safe, filled with ordinary people going about their ordinary business. As Torrio helped his wife from their car, carrying packages from a shopping trip, a dark sedan pulled up beside them. Bugs Morin and Hymie Weiss stepped out, submachine guns in their hands. What followed was chaos. The guns roared, spitting bullets at Torrio and his wife. Anna Torrio, screaming in terror, fled into the building unharmed. Johnny Torrio was not so fortunate. Hit multiple times, he collapsed on the sidewalk. Morin and Weiss approached the fallen mob boss, ready to finish the job. Morin placed his gun against Torio's head for the coup de grace, the final shot that would end the life of the man who had ordered O'Banion's death. But when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The gun was empty, its magazine spent in the initial barrage. In that moment of hesitation, as Morin fumbled to reload, a laundry truck driver turned onto the street. Fearing witnesses, Weiss and Morin fled, leaving Torio bleeding but alive on the sidewalk. Torio survived, but barely. He spent weeks in the hospital, recovering from his wounds while under police guard. The attack changed him fundamentally. Johnny Torrio, who had tried to organize Chicago's gangs into a peaceful, profitable arrangement, who had sought to minimize violence as bad for business, now understood that there could be no peace with the North Side Gang. More than that, he understood that as long as he remained in Chicago, he would be a target, that Weiss and Morin would never stop trying to kill him, that one day they would succeed where they had failed on South Clyde Avenue. Upon his release from the hospital, Torrio made a decision that shocked the Chicago underworld. He was retiring. He had served a brief sentence for the Sebin Brewery raid that O'Banion had arranged, and that taste of prison life, combined with nearly being killed, was enough. Torrio turned his entire operation over to Al Capone, his young lieutenant from Brooklyn. At 32 years old, Al Capone became the most powerful gangster in Chicago. The student had become the master, but the lesson he had learned from his mentor's near death was clear. The North Side Gang had to be destroyed completely, utterly, or there would never be peace. Capone, despite his later reputation for violence, initially tried to make peace. He reached out to Weiss through intermediaries, offering generous terms. The territories could be redrawn, profits could be shared, past grudges could be forgotten. Capone understood that the violence was bad for business, that constant warfare meant dead soldiers, destroyed speakeasies, and unwanted police attention. But Weiss's response was unequivocal. There would be no peace while Capone and the men who had killed O'Banion remained alive. This was no longer about business or territory. This was about blood and honor and loyalty to a fallen friend. The North Side Gang struck again and again throughout 1925 and into 1926. They bombed speakeasies owned by the outfit, hijacked beer trucks, assassinated mid-level outfit operatives. Capone's men retaliated in kind. The newspapers, which had once found the gang wars somewhat entertaining, began to express alarm at the escalating violence. Innocent people were being caught in the crossfire. Bombs were going off in residential neighborhoods. The line between the underworld and the ordinary world was dissolving, and Chicago's citizens, who had tolerated the gangs as long as they kept their violence contained, began demanding that authorities do something. But what could the authorities do? The police were corrupted top to bottom, taking bribes from both sides. Politicians were in the pockets of gangsters, had been for years, and saw no reason to change a profitable arrangement. The few honest cops and prosecutors who tried to build cases against the major gangsters found themselves stymied at every turn by missing witnesses, destroyed evidence, and judges who threw out cases on technicalities. Chicago was a city where the criminals had won, where they operated with such impunity that they could commit murder in broad daylight and know they would never face real consequences. In September 1926, Jaime Weiss made his boldest move yet. He decided to kill Al Capone in his headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero. The attack was audacious in its scale and its brazenness. On September 20, a convoy of cars drove slowly past the Hawthorne Inn. As they passed, gunmen opened fire with machine guns, rifles, and shotguns, pouring more than 1,000 rounds into the building. The attack lasted only minutes but felt like hours to those inside. Windows shattered, walls were torn apart by bullets, and the air filled with gunpowder smoke and the screams of wounded men. Capone, who had been having lunch in the restaurant, threw himself to the floor at the first sound of gunfire. His bodyguard, Frankie Rio, covered Capone's body with his own, shielding his boss from the hail of bullets. When the shooting finally stopped and Capone emerged from the wreckage, he was shaken but unharmed. However, a woman having lunch in the hotel with her husband had been wounded by flying glass. The idea that an innocent bystander had been hurt in an attempt on his life enraged Capone in ways that dead gangsters never did. This was a violation of the unwritten code that governed gang warfare. Civilians were not supposed to get hurt. But Weiss had miscalculated. The attack at the Hawthorne Inn, rather than killing Capone, had only strengthened his resolve to eliminate the North Side Gang. More than that, it had damaged the North Siders' reputation. Even among criminals there were standards, lines that should not be crossed. The attack had been too public, too reckless, had endangered too many ordinary people. Weiss had always been more ruthless than O'Banion, less concerned with public opinion or maintaining the gang's Robin Hood image. That ruthlessness, combined with his single-minded focus on killing Capone, would prove to be his downfall. On October 11, 1926, just 3 weeks after the attack on the Hawthorne Inn, Jaime Weiss was walking toward his headquarters at Schofield's flower shop, the same place where O'Banion had died nearly 2 years earlier. With him were several associates, including his bodyguards. They had just left Holy Name Cathedral, directly across the street, where Weiss had attended Mass as he did every week. It was midday on a Monday, the streets were busy with traffic and pedestrians, and no one noticed the men positioned in the second-floor window of a rooming house overlooking the flower shop. As Weiss reached the entrance to Schofield's, machine gun fire erupted from above. The attack was perfectly planned and perfectly executed. Weiss was hit multiple times and died almost instantly on the same sidewalk where he had mourned O'Banion. His bodyguards fell around him, caught in the same deadly crossfire. The gunmen escaped in the confusion, disappearing into Chicago's vast network of gang-controlled neighborhoods where no witness would ever speak and no investigation would ever find them. Jaime Weiss was 28 years old when he died. He had led the North Side Gang for less than 2 years, but in that time, he had proven himself one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. Unlike O'Banion, who had at least maintained a veneer of charm and respectability, Weiss had been pure violence, driven by loyalty and revenge to wage a war he could never win. His funeral, like O'Banion's before him, was an elaborate affair, though somewhat smaller, as if the city was growing weary of burying gangsters with the pomp of fallen heroes. Leadership of the North Side Gang now fell to Vincent the Schemer Drucci. Born Vincenzo D'Ambrosio, Drucci was the only Italian member of the predominantly Irish North Side Gang, accepted because of his long history with O'Banion and the others, dating back to their days in the Market Street Gang. Drucci was called the Schemer because of his love of elaborate plans and his slightly unhinged personality. He was more volatile than either O'Banion or Weiss, prone to outbursts of violence that sometimes seemed to come from nowhere. Under Drucci's leadership, the gang continued its war with Capone, but with less focus and intensity than under Weiss. Drucci was not the tactician that Weiss had been, nor did he have O'Banion's political connections and business acumen. The North Side Gang, which had once been the equal of any organization in Chicago, was beginning to weaken. Members were dying or drifting away, territory was being lost, and the constant warfare was draining resources faster than bootlegging could replenish them. Drucci's reign as leader of the North Side Gang lasted only a few months. On April 4, 1927, during Chicago's mayoral primary, Drucci was riding in a car with several other men when they were pulled over by police. What exactly happened next remains disputed, lost in the chaos of that moment, but the outcome was undeniable. A struggle ensued between Drucci and Detective Dan Healy. Shots were fired. When it was over, Vincent Drucci lay dead in the back of the police car, killed by a cop rather than by rival gangsters. Some said Drucci had been reaching for a gun and Healy had acted in self-defense. Others whispered that it was an assassination, that Healy had been paid by Capone to kill Drucci during a routine traffic stop. The truth died with Drucci, but the result was the same. Another leader of the North Side Gang was dead. Now only one of O'Banion's original inner circle remained, George "Bugs" Moran. Born Adelard Cunin to French immigrants, Moran had adopted an Irish name and had been one of O'Banion's most loyal soldiers. He was called Bugs because of his volatile temper and erratic behavior, though compared to Drucci, he was actually relatively stable. Moran was tall, handsome, and intelligent, but he lacked the charisma of O'Banion and the cold calculation of Weiss. He became leader of the North Side Gang not because he was the best choice, but because he was the only choice left. By 1927, when Moran took control, the North Side Gang was a shadow of what it had been under O'Banion. The constant warfare had depleted their ranks, and Capone's organization, now called the Chicago Outfit, controlled most of the city. The North Siders still held their traditional territory on the North Side and the Gold Coast, but they were surrounded and outnumbered. Worse, the public mood was turning against them. The violence that had once seemed romantic or exciting, when confined to gangsters killing other gangsters, had spilled over too often into the lives of ordinary citizens. Moran understood the precariousness of his position, but like Weiss before him, he refused to make peace with Capone. The deaths of O'Banion, Weiss, and Drucci demanded vengeance. More than that, Morin genuinely hated Capone and everything he represented. The rivalry between the North Side gang and the outfit was no longer just about business or territory, it was personal, a blood feud that could only end with the complete destruction of one side or the other. Throughout 1927 and 1928, the violence continued, though at a lower intensity than during Weiss's leadership. Morin's gang still hijacked outfit beer shipments, still bombed outfit speakeasies, still killed outfit soldiers when opportunities arose. But they were fighting a losing battle. Capone's resources were virtually unlimited, his political connections extended to the highest levels of city and state government, and his organization was professionally run with the efficiency of a legitimate business. Capone, for his part, had grown tired of the North Side gang's continued resistance. He had tried peace and been rejected. He had tried intimidation and achieved only temporary respite. The North Siders, depleted and weakened as they were, continued to be a thorn in his side, disrupting his operations and challenging his authority. Something had to be done, something final and brutal that would once and for all demonstrate the futility of opposing the Chicago outfit. Capone began planning what would become the most infamous act of violence in American gangster history. The idea was to eliminate the North Side gang's leadership in a single, devastating blow. If Morin and his top lieutenants could be killed together, the organization would collapse. There would be no one left to lead, no one left to fight, and the territories they controlled could be absorbed into the outfit without further resistance. Capone put his most trusted men to work on the plan, including Machine Gun Jack McGurn, a particularly brutal enforcer who had his own reasons to hate the North Siders. They had killed his stepfather. The plan that evolved was simple in concept but required careful execution. The North Siders would be lured to a specific location with the promise of a shipment of hijacked whiskey at a bargain price. Once they were all together, Capone's men, disguised as police officers conducting a raid, would line them up against a wall and kill them. The police disguises served multiple purposes. They would prevent the North Siders from immediately fighting back, as even gangsters generally surrendered when confronted by what appeared to be police. The disguises would also create confusion after the fact, making it harder for witnesses to identify the real killers. Throughout the fall and winter of 1928, Capone's men conducted surveillance on Morin and his gang, learning their routines and habits. They identified a garage on North Clark Street that the North Siders used as a distribution point for their bootlegging operations. The building, the SMC Cartage Company, was perfect for Capone's purposes, isolated enough that a massacre wouldn't immediately attract attention, but not so remote that the North Siders would be suspicious about meeting there. As 1928 turned to 1929, everything was in place. Capone, careful to establish an alibi, traveled to Florida, ensuring he would be far from Chicago when the massacre occurred. The killers were selected and briefed. The date was chosen, February 14, 1929. Valentine's Day, a day of love and romance, would become a day of slaughter that would shock America and finally turn public opinion decisively against the gangsters who had ruled Chicago for nearly a decade. But while Capone and his men prepared their trap, the North Side gang continued their daily routines, unaware that death was stalking them. Bugs Morin went about his business, meeting with allies, overseeing bootlegging operations, and planning his own strikes against the outfit. His men gathered at the North Clark Street garage, handling shipments, counting money, and talking about ordinary things: family, women, the boxing matches they had bet on, their hopes for the future. These were not just gangsters. They were sons and brothers, husbands and fathers. Some, like O'Banion before them, attended Mass and considered themselves good Catholics despite their criminal careers. They came from immigrant families who had struggled to survive in America, who had found the legitimate economy closed to them, and who had turned to crime as the only route to prosperity and respect. They were products of their time and place, shaped by poverty, prejudice, and a city that seemed to run on corruption and violence. The North Side Gang, in its prime under O'Banion, had represented something more than just another criminal organization. They had been protectors of their community, providing services the city would not, offering employment when legitimate work was unavailable, and defending their neighborhoods against other gangs and corrupt police. They had maintained standards, refusing to profit from prostitution when other gangs embraced it, and had genuinely believed they were serving their people. That those services came wrapped in violence and lawbreaking did not diminish, in their minds, the legitimacy of their role. Now, after years of warfare, after losing O'Banion, Weiss, Drucci, and so many others, the North Side Gang was diminished but not destroyed. The men who remained were loyal, tough, and determined to honor the memory of their fallen leaders by continuing the fight. They knew the odds were against them. They knew Capone's organization was stronger, richer, and better connected. But they also knew that surrender was not an option, that they had gone too far and lost too much to simply give up and acknowledge Capone's supremacy. Pride, that same pride that had led O'Banion to insult the Italians and refuse to compromise, kept them fighting even when fighting seemed futile. As February 14, 1929, dawned cold and gray over Chicago, 7 men made their way to the garage on North Clark Street. They were expecting a shipment of whiskey and a chance to make a good profit. Instead, they were walking into a trap that would end their lives and, in a larger sense, end the era of the North Side Gang. What happened in that garage would become legend, would be chronicled in countless books and movies, would become synonymous with gangster violence. But more than that, it would represent the final act in a tragedy that had begun 5 years earlier when Dean O'Banion extended his hand to shake with men who had come to kill him. The story of the North Side Gang was always going to end in blood. That was the nature of the world they inhabited, the rules of the game they had chosen to play. But the particular way it ended, the brutality and cold calculation of the scent. Valentine's Day Massacre would transform these gangsters from criminals into something else, symbols of an era, martyrs of a sort, and permanent fixtures in American mythology. The morning of February 14, 1929, began like any other in Chicago. Temperatures hovered around 18 degrees, a typical brutal winter day in the city. Fresh snow covered the streets and a bitter wind blew in from Lake Michigan. Business owners opened their shops, workers trudged to their jobs, and somewhere in the vastness of the city, 7 men made their way to a garage on North Clark Street, unaware they had only hours left to live. The SMC Cartage Company at 2122 North Clark Street was an unremarkable brick building, indistinguishable from dozens of other warehouses and garages that lined the industrial streets of Chicago's North Side. Inside, the garage served as a front for the North Side Gang's bootlegging operations, a place where trucks were loaded and unloaded, where whiskey was counted and money changed hands. On this particular morning, 7 men had gathered there, supposedly to inspect a shipment of hijacked whiskey being offered at a bargain price. It was the kind of deal that came up regularly in the bootlegging business, the kind that required quick decisions and cash on hand. Among the 7 men were several key members and associates of Bugs Moran's organization. There was Adam Hayer, the accountant who managed the gang's financial records and kept track of the complex web of payments, bribes, and profits that made up their operation. Albert Weinshank, who physically resembled Bugs Moran so closely that even those who knew both men sometimes did double takes, was there managing logistics. Frank and Pete Gusenberg, brothers who were among the most feared enforcers in the North Side Gang, men who had survived countless battles in the beer wars, waited with their colleagues. James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law, was present, as was John May, a mechanic who worked on the gang's vehicles and was only loosely affiliated with their criminal operations. The 7th man was Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who had become fascinated by gangsters and hung around the North Side Gang hoping to experience the thrill of criminal life. He was about to discover that the reality of that life was far different from the romantic image he had constructed in his imagination. The one person who was not there was the most important, Bugs Moran himself. He was running late that morning, delayed by circumstances that would save his life. Had he arrived on time, had traffic been lighter or his business finished earlier, he would have died with his men. Instead, fate granted him a reprieve, though whether that reprieve was a blessing or a curse is a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, a black Cadillac that looked exactly like a police car pulled up in front of the garage. 4 men got out, 2 of them dressed in Chicago police uniforms, the other 2 in civilian clothes but wearing long overcoats that concealed their weapons. To anyone watching from the street, it appeared to be a routine police raid, the kind of thing that happened occasionally even in gang-controlled neighborhoods, usually resulting in a few arrests, some confiscated liquor, and everyone back on the streets within hours after the appropriate bribes were paid. The 4 men entered the garage. Inside, the 7 members and associates of the North Side Gang were ordered to line up against the north wall. This too seemed routine, standard police procedure during a raid. The men complied without resistance, facing the brick wall with their hands raised or placed against the wall. They expected to be searched, possibly arrested, certainly inconvenienced, but nothing more serious than that. They had been through police raids before. This was just the cost of doing business in Prohibition-era Chicago. Then the guns opened fire. 2 Thompson submachine guns, a shotgun, and various pistols erupted in the confined space of the garage, creating a thunderous roar that seemed to go on forever, though it lasted only seconds. The 7 men against the wall had no chance to fight back, no time to even understand what was happening before the bullets tore through them. Frank Gusenberg, incredibly tough even by the standards of Chicago gangsters, survived the initial barrage despite being shot 14 times. The other 6 died almost instantly, their bodies shredded by the hail of bullets, their blood pooling on the garage floor and spattering the brick wall behind them. When the shooting stopped, the 2 men in civilian clothes dropped their weapons and raised their hands as if they were being arrested. The 2 men in police uniforms marched them out of the garage at gunpoint, maintaining the illusion of a legitimate police operation. To anyone watching from nearby buildings or passing on the street, it appeared that the police had conducted a raid, arrested 2 suspects, and were taking them away. The black Cadillac drove off into the Chicago morning, disappearing into the city's vast network of streets and alleys, leaving behind a scene that would become permanently seared into American consciousness. Inside the garage, Frank Gusenberg clung to life. When real police officers arrived, responding to reports of the shooting, they found him still breathing despite his devastating injuries. "Who shot you?" the officers demanded, desperately hoping for a name, a description, something that would allow them to bring the killers to justice. But Gusenberg, adhering to the code of the streets even as he lay dying, refused to cooperate. "Nobody shot me," he whispered, his last words before losing consciousness. He died 3 hours later at Alexian Brothers Hospital, taking whatever he knew about the massacre to his grave. The crime scene was horrific even by Chicago's blood-soaked standards. The newspaper photographers who arrived documented everything in gruesome detail: the bodies sprawled against the wall, the pools of blood, the bullet holes that pockmarked the brick, the discarded weapons. These photographs would appear in newspapers across America and around the world, shocking readers and permanently changing the public's attitude toward gangster violence. What had once seemed almost romantic, the bootleggers providing illegal liquor to a thirsty public, the colorful gangsters with their fancy clothes and faster cars, now appeared in its true light as brutal, senseless slaughter. The massacre was immediately attributed to Al Capone, though he was careful to ensure he had an alibi. On February 14, 1929, Capone was in Florida, hosting a party at his estate in Miami, surrounded by witnesses who could attest to his presence. He had not pulled the trigger, had not even been in Chicago when the killings occurred. But everyone knew he had ordered the hit, had planned it, had selected the killers, and approved every detail of the operation. The police knew it, the newspapers knew it, the other gangsters knew it, and the American public knew it. But knowing and proving were different things. Despite an intensive investigation, despite the international attention focused on the case, despite the reward money offered and the political pressure applied, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for the sin. Valentine's Day Massacre. Machine Gun Jack McGurn, widely believed to have been one of the planners, was brought in for questioning but released due to an alibi provided by his girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, who became known in the press as the Blonde Alibi. Other suspects were identified but never charged, either due to lack of evidence or because they died before they could be brought to trial. The massacre accomplished Capone's goal in one sense: it effectively destroyed the North Side Gang as an organized force. The killing of so many key members in a single blow shattered morale and disrupted operations. Bugs Moran, who had narrowly escaped death that morning, was a broken man. His organization, which had once controlled the lucrative North Side and Gold Coast territories, which had fought the Chicago outfit to a standstill for years, crumbled. Members defected to other gangs or left the criminal life altogether. The breweries and speakeasies that had generated millions in revenue were taken over by the outfit. The North Side's reign over Chicago's Irish neighborhoods came to an end, but in another, more important sense, the massacre was a catastrophic failure for Capone and the outfit. The sheer brutality of the killings, the cold-blooded execution of 7 men lined up against a wall, shocked America in ways that ordinary gang violence never had. Newspaper editorials that had once treated gangsters with a kind of bemused tolerance now called for their complete elimination. Citizens who had patronized speakeasies and thought prohibition was a joke began to reconsider their complicity in a system that generated such violence. Politicians who had been content to take gangster bribes and look the other way faced mounting pressure to actually enforce the law. President Herbert Hoover, responding to the national outrage, made defeating Al Capone a personal priority. Federal agents who had largely stayed out of Chicago's gang wars now descended on the city with orders to destroy Capone's organization by any means necessary. The Chicago Crime Commission published its first public enemies list in 1930, with Al Capone at number 1. The man who had seemed untouchable, who had dined with mayors and police chiefs, who had operated openly for years without facing serious legal consequences, suddenly found himself targeted by the full weight of the federal government. In the end, it was not murder that brought down Capone, but something far more mundane: tax evasion. Federal agents, led by Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, built a case not on the hundreds of murders Capone had ordered or committed, not on the massive bootlegging operation he ran, but on his failure to pay taxes on his illegal income. It was an anticlimactic end for America's most famous gangster, but it was effective. In 1931, Capone was convicted of federal income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He served time in Atlanta and then at Alcatraz, the new maximum security federal prison on an island in San Francisco Bay designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals. By the time he was released in 1939, his health destroyed by untreated syphilis and the harsh conditions of prison, he was no longer the powerful crime lord who had ruled Chicago. He retired to his Florida estate and died in 1947, his mind gone, his empire long since passed to others. Bugs Moran, the last survivor of O'Banion's inner circle, lived much longer but in far diminished circumstances. After the massacre, he attempted to maintain some semblance of his bootlegging operation, but without the soldiers and resources that had made the North Side Gang formidable, he was reduced to small-time operations. When Prohibition ended in 1933, eliminating the source of easy wealth that had funded Chicago's gangs, Moran descended further into criminality's lower rungs. He was arrested multiple times for various crimes, spent years in prison, and eventually died in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1957, of lung cancer, alone and forgotten. The man who had once been a millionaire bootlegger, who had commanded an army of gangsters and controlled Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods, died a prison inmate with nothing to his name. The ending of Prohibition in 1933 transformed Chicago's underworld just as profoundly as its beginning had in 1920. The enormous profits that had funded the gangs, that had corrupted police and politicians, that had turned street thugs into millionaires, disappeared almost overnight. Some gangsters adapted, moving into other rackets: labor racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, the various enterprises that would sustain organized crime through the rest of the 20th century. Others simply faded away, returning to legitimate work or dying in obscurity. The Chicago outfit, built on the foundation that Johnny Torrio established and Al Capone expanded, survived and even prospered after Prohibition. Under new leadership, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and later Sam Giancana, the organization adapted to changing circumstances, maintaining its power through political corruption, control of labor unions, and eventually the development of Las Vegas casinos. The outfit would remain a force in Chicago and American organized crime for decades, though it would never again achieve the kind of open, brazen power it wielded during Prohibition. But the North Side Gang, the Irish organization that Dean O'Banion had built, that Jaime Weiss had led into war, that Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran had tried to maintain, was finished. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had been its death blow, and unlike the outfit, there was no resurrection, no adaptation to new circumstances. The Irish gangsters who had once dominated Chicago's criminal landscape became historical footnotes, remembered primarily for their role in the story of Al Capone rather than for their own achievements and tragedies. This erasure from history represents a kind of final defeat. The Italian-American gangsters, Capone, Torrio, Ricca, Accardo, became legends, the subjects of countless books, movies, and television shows. Their names are known to generations of Americans who know little else about Chicago history. But O'Banion, Weiss, Drucci, and Moran have largely been forgotten outside of specialized histories of organized crime. When they are remembered, it is usually as the victims of more famous gangsters rather than as complex figures in their own right. Yet their story deserves to be remembered and understood, not because it glorifies crime or violence, but because it reveals something fundamental about the American experience in the early 20th century. The Irish gangsters of Chicago's North Side were products of a particular historical moment, when massive immigration met urban poverty, when ethnic prejudice closed off legitimate paths to success, when a deeply unpopular law created unprecedented criminal opportunities, and when political corruption was so pervasive that crime and government became virtually indistinguishable. These men were not born criminals. They were born into poverty in neighborhoods where survival often meant breaking the law, where the police were as likely to prey on you as protect you, where the American dream seemed like a cruel joke played on people who looked different or spoke with accents. They came from immigrant communities that had suffered centuries of oppression in Ireland, had fled famine and persecution, had arrived in America hoping for opportunity and finding, instead, new forms of exploitation and prejudice. In that context, Dean O'Banion's path from Kilgubbin Street Kid to millionaire bootlegger was not an aberration, but a logical response to the circumstances he faced. When legitimate society denies you opportunity, when the laws seem designed to keep you in your place, when the politicians and police are as corrupt as any criminal, then crime becomes not just an option but a form of resistance, a way of asserting dignity and power in a system designed to deny you both. This is not to excuse the violence and brutality that O'Banion and his gang committed. They killed people, sometimes innocent people caught in crossfire or targeted by mistake. They corrupted elections, bribed officials, and contributed to the breakdown of law and order in Chicago. Their bootlegging operations, while providing a service that many citizens wanted, also distributed alcohol of sometimes questionable quality that could and did poison drinkers. They were criminals who chose violence as a way of life and profited from the suffering of others. But they were also complex human beings who contained multitudes of contradictions. O'Banion genuinely loved flowers and created beautiful arrangements. He sang in church choirs and attended Mass regularly. He was loyal to his friends and generous to the poor in his neighborhood. Jaime Weiss was a devout Catholic who never worked on Sundays or religious holidays. Bugs Morin, for all his violence, maintained certain moral lines, refusing to profit from prostitution even when it would have been lucrative. These contradictions reveal the tragedy at the heart of their story. These were men with talents and capabilities that, in different circumstances, might have led to legitimate success and respect. O'Banion's charm and political skills, Weiss's organizational abilities, Morin's intelligence, all of these could have been assets in legal enterprises. But the society they lived in did not value their talents, did not offer them paths to advancement, did not see them as fully American or fully human. The broader story of Irish-American gangsters in Chicago is part of a larger pattern that repeated itself with each new wave of immigration. The Irish dominated early organized crime in Chicago, New York, and other American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then, as Irish immigrants and their children began to assimilate and gain access to legitimate opportunities, Italian immigrants took over the criminal enterprises. Later, Jewish gangsters played significant roles. In more recent times, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and Eastern European criminal organizations have filled similar niches. This pattern reveals an uncomfortable truth about American society. Organized crime has often served as a perverse form of social mobility for immigrant and marginalized communities. When legitimate paths to wealth and power are blocked by prejudice and discrimination, crime offers an alternative. It is a path that leads ultimately to prison or death, but for young men with limited options and burning ambitions, it can seem like the only path available. The end of the North Side Gang and the gradual decline of Irish dominance in organized crime coincided with the broader acceptance of Irish Americans into mainstream American society. By the 1960s, when John F. Kennedy became the first Irish Catholic president, the days when Irish immigrants faced "No Irish Need Apply" signs were fading into memory. As legitimate opportunities opened up, as discrimination lessened, the need for criminal alternatives diminished. The great-grandchildren of the Irish immigrants who had peopled the slums of Kilgubbin became doctors, lawyers, businesspeople, politicians, achieving through legitimate means what O'Banion and his generation had sought through crime. This is perhaps the final irony of the North Side Gang story. They fought and killed and died to carve out space and dignity for their community in a hostile America, and in a twisted way, they succeeded. The money they made, however illegally obtained, funded churches and charities. The political power they wielded, however corruptly exercised, gave Irish Americans a voice in city government. The fear they inspired forced the broader society to acknowledge and reckon with the Irish presence in Chicago. They broke down barriers through violence and criminality that had been impervious to peaceful efforts, creating opportunities that later generations of Irish Americans would exploit through legitimate means. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of men died in the beer wars, most of them young men who might have lived long lives and contributed to their communities had they found different paths. Families were shattered by violence and imprisonment. Communities that might have built legitimate institutions and businesses instead became dependent on criminal enterprises. The corruption that the gangsters fostered, the bought police, the crooked politicians, the degradation of civic institutions, damaged Chicago in ways that persisted long after Prohibition ended. The legacy of the North Side Gang and the beer wars extends beyond Chicago's Irish community and beyond the 1920s and 1930s. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in particular became a cultural touchstone, referenced in countless works of art and entertainment, a symbol of American violence and lawlessness. The image of 7 men lined up against a garage wall and gunned down in cold blood became permanently embedded in the American imagination, representing something dark and disturbing about the American character. The massacre also changed how Americans thought about organized crime and prohibition. Before February 14, 1929, many Americans viewed bootleggers with a kind of amused tolerance, even admiration. They were colorful characters who provided a service, illegal alcohol, that most people wanted and saw no harm in consuming. The gang wars seemed like something confined to the criminal underworld, a problem that didn't really affect ordinary citizens. The massacre shattered these comfortable illusions. It demonstrated in the most graphic way possible that the violence was real, that the criminals were not romantic antiheroes but brutal killers, and that the system of illegal alcohol production and distribution came at a terrible human cost. In this sense, the North Side Gang's destruction helped bring about the end of Prohibition. The public revulsion following the massacre contributed to the growing movement to repeal the 18th Amendment, a movement that would succeed in 1933. The very violence that defined the beer wars that the gangsters used to build their empires ultimately undermined the system that had made those empires possible. There is a kind of poetry in this, a tragic inevitability. The North Side Gang rose through violence and fell through violence. They built their empire on the killing of rivals and saw that empire destroyed when their rivals killed them. The brewery raid that led to O'Banion's death was an act of betrayal that began the cycle of revenge killings that would only end when one side was completely destroyed. Each murder O'Banion, Weiss, Drucci, the 7 victims of the Valentine's Day Massacre, was both a victory and a defeat, eliminating an enemy but also creating new enemies and guaranteeing future violence. On the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, there is today nothing to mark what happened there. The building was demolished in 1967, and the vacant lot that remained was eventually developed into a landscaped lawn for senior citizen housing. The bricks from the garage wall where the 7 men died, soaked with their blood, were sold to collectors and curiosity seekers, scattered across America like relics of saints. The garage itself, for years a macabre tourist attraction where people came to see where the massacre occurred, disappeared as thoroughly as the men who died there. This physical erasure mirrors the historical erasure of the North Side Gang from popular memory. Walk through Chicago's North Side today, through the neighborhoods that O'Banion and his gang once controlled, and you will find almost nothing to indicate that one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America once held sway over these streets. The breweries they protected are long gone, demolished, or converted to other uses. The speakeasies where they sold illegal liquor are now restaurants, shops, or luxury condominiums. The flower shop where O'Banion died, across from Holy Name Cathedral, is gone. Even the street names have changed in some cases, erasing the last traces of that violent era. But for those who lived through the beer wars, the memories never faded. The widows and orphans of the men who died, the mothers who buried their sons, the neighborhoods that lost their protectors and providers, for them, the violence was not history but lived experience, trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. The children who grew up during Prohibition, who heard machine gun fire on their streets and saw bodies on their sidewalks, who learned that the police were corrupt and the gangsters were heroes, carried those lessons into adulthood and passed them to their children. This is the real legacy of Dean O'Banion and the North Side Gang, not the mythology of gangsters and gun battles, not the romanticized image of bootleggers and speakeasies, but the actual human cost of a system that made crime more profitable than legitimate work, that corrupted institutions meant to serve the public, and that resolved disputes through violence rather than law. It is a legacy written in blood and tears, in shattered families and stunted lives, in communities that turned to crime because no legitimate alternatives existed and paid the price for generations afterward. When Dino Banyan extended his hand in friendship on that November morning in 1924, when he reached out to shake hands with the men who had come to kill him, he was enacting in miniature the tragedy of his entire life and the entire era. He had tried to build something in a world that would not accept him as he was, had used violence to create space for himself and his community, had achieved wealth and power through criminality because legitimate paths were closed to him. And in the end, the same violence he had wielded so effectively turned against him, just as it would turn against all those who followed his path. The flower shop where he died, surrounded by beauty in his final moments, represents the contradiction at the heart of his life: the gangster who loved flowers, the killer who sang in church choirs, the criminal who saw himself as a community protector. He was a product of his time and place, shaped by forces larger than himself, trying to carve out dignity and prosperity in a society that offered him only poverty and prejudice. He failed, as they all failed in the end, but the trying, the sheer audacity of believing they could build something lasting through violence and crime, remains both fascinating and heartbreaking. The story of the Irish gangsters who made Chicago bleed is ultimately a story about America itself, about immigration and assimilation, about the gap between American ideals and American realities, about what happens when laws lose legitimacy and institutions become corrupt, about the price of prejudice and the cost of exclusion. It is a story that ended with the repeal of Prohibition and the decline of the North Side Gang, but the lessons it teaches remain relevant. When society denies opportunity to segments of its population, when laws seem arbitrary or unjust, when legitimate institutions fail to serve the public, people will find alternative paths to power and prosperity, even if those paths lead ultimately to destruction. The North Side Gang chose crime and violence, paid the ultimate price, and in their rise and fall revealed uncomfortable truths about the society that created them and the America they tried to conquer through the barrel of a gun.